Hi, everybody. Welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. We are very, very excited to be joined by Alison Wilding tonight, presenting on her work. And she joins us from London. So thank you, Alison, for taking the time to be with us. I know it's a later evening for you. And I have a feeling there's some other fellow countrymen joining. So thank you to all of you and to all of our other audience members. It's great to see everybody here. I would also like to just quickly recognize that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported in part by the public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. This programming would not be possible without the many contributions from viewers like yourselves. So I would like to thank you, and please do consider making a donation to the lecture series through our website at www.nysс.org. Thank you very much. I would also like to just quickly, before I introduce Alison, point out at the bottom of your screen the Q&A button. At any time during the lecture, please do feel free to enter in a question, and we'll leave time after the talk to come back and ask those questions. And you can always put in your questions at the end as well. Alison Wilding's sculpture has challenged expectations since she first rose to prominence as part of the so-called New British Sculpture in the 1980s. With over 5 decades of work, the work is characterized by her particular manipulation of materials and ranges in scale from the near monumental to small handheld objects, and continues to evolve. She says that beyond Brexit and Covid, the ongoing climate change crisis is causing her to assess her practice. I was also very moved by a quote from Betty Cunningham Gallery's website, when she says, "I think what you see is absolutely what you get, and also maybe what you don't see." Alison currently has an exhibition at Betty Cunningham Gallery on view until November 6th, titled Alison Wilding, Alabaster and Other Stories. So I recommend everyone to go see that. That's in the city. Without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Alison Wilding.
Thanks everyone, and hi, and thank you for checking in or joining or whatever the terminology is. 3 words that sort of have swamped everyone at the moment, certainly in the UK. Brexit, which has happened, nothing we can do about it. We have to move on, I think. But COVID and climate crisis have conjoined to bring about with me a situation where I've kind of had to put the brakes on with what I'm doing. I'm finding it very difficult to make new work, and I think that's what I'm always trying to do, to make something that I don't know anything about. And right now that is really eluding me. However, life goes on. It is what it is, as we say here. This is my drawing studio at home, where I spent the first lockdown, which was really fantastically enjoyable. It was so quiet, no one was about, you could hear the bees, there were no planes, and I did a lot of drawing. But eventually I did go back to the studio, and the only way that I could justify making work at that time, and it was fantastically difficult, was to draw on all the materials that I had in my studio. I mean, like everyone who moves every few years to a different studio, you bring a whole load of stuff with you. So I've got racks of old bits of metal, bits of wood that have been laminated and twisted, that have been lying around. and suddenly something happens. So with all this very kind of fugitive material, I made 3 works, and this was, I'm not even sure whether this was the first one, but I put it together in about 10 minutes. And then this one was made with the help of a new assistant, actually. And what you see in the middle is a paper boat that's kind of sitting there. And the third object was made from brass rod and brass tube that I had lying around in the studio. And I tore up a Vivienne Westwood skirt that I had to cover this very large acrylic sphere with the fabric. I think COVID has made everyone think about the kind of materials that they use and what they feel that they simply cannot carry on working with, like concrete, steel, almost anything, and certainly plastics, all of which I've used in the past, which makes it incredibly difficult to move forward. But anyway, I had these 3 very separate pieces of work lying around for maybe 6 months. And then fairly recently, I put them all together because I think actually this is all one work. And I titled it 3 Ways of, 3 Ways of what? I don't really know. Possibly something about movement. There's something very kind of jittery in the piece on the left, and something very static about the wooden structure with the paper boat. And with the other piece, there's a kind of tentative sort of movement towards, away from, a kind of stop-go situation. I don't think this is the work that I would ever show, but I think sometimes one makes works that simply have to be made, and they mark a particular point of time. They're not to be shown to anyone else, and they're certainly that I don't think I'd put this work in an exhibition, but I'm quite glad I did it. The other thing that I've done is to use materials that have been lying around. Actually, what you can hear is a train just going overhead. My studio is in, I'm in my studio in Hackney at the moment, and the overground train service goes overhead. It'll probably stop about midnight, I think. So I've recently had some building work done on my house, and I've got this copper drain pipe, and also this sort of cladding, which is it's cement board, which is a new sheet material, quite new to me. And I made this work, which is quite curious, I think. It's either a very tall crown sitting on a hexagram, which is a 6-pointed star, glued together by small pieces of wood. And I kind of like the ambivalence of a crown on a star, and they're pointing in really different directions. And over the years, I think I've made several kind of pointed objects, and this one just kind of rests on a cusp of not quite understanding what is going where. So it's kind of a curious piece. I used the cement board. This was last year in 2020 to make a very small wall piece where, with very thin brass wire, I kind of drew a sort of calligraphy which, with sort of soldered pins on it, it fixes into the cement board. It's a very small piece of work. This is the card for the show that I've got at the moment at Betty Cunningham, and because of travel restrictions, I haven't seen it. I wasn't there to install it, and I'm not able to go over and see it, which is really sad. I think it looks really good from what I can tell, because Cece from the gallery went over there, and I think she did a great job of installing it with a technician. It's called Alabaster and Other Stories, which is quite an ambiguous title, I think, because there aren't really any stories. My work doesn't contain any backstory. You don't need to know anything about it before you encounter it. It's about the encounter with the work, the person and the work. It's about looking. It's not about knowing anything about it beforehand. But because the word alabaster is in the title, it's something that I'm going to start talking about. So to get on to some much older pieces of work. So this is 1994 when I went to quite a famous alabaster mine in the middle of England in a place called Tutbury in Staffordshire. And for some reason I went with my mother. I can't remember really why. And I can't even remember why I wanted to buy a piece of alabaster, because I'd always thought it was a kind of horrific material. That when you're a student at art school doing a bit of stone carving as a sort of project, there'd be bits of alabaster lying around that nobody wanted to touch. But anyway, we went to this mine, and the way that they test the alabaster in the mine is by throwing water over the stone and then shining a torch on it. English alabaster is quite famous for its what's known as its streaky bacon colour, which is a sort of it's a kind of iron mud that seeps into the material which is mined. So when we were there, I met these two 3.5-ton dressed blocks of alabaster and thought they were absolutely amazing. And the mine manager told me that they had been ordered by a woman who wanted to slice them up to tile her bathroom. And I thought this was just appalling, and I told him that. So I bought a very small piece of alabaster, went home, and then I had a phone call from the mine about a week later saying that the woman, had dropped out of the equation, and was I actually interested in having these two 3.5-ton blocks? And I immediately said yes, without having a single idea as to why I wanted them, what I would do them. It's just that that they were so compelling as two objects in their own right. So they were paid for, not by me, but by someone else. And they came to my studio, which this was the best studio I ever had, which had a huge kind of sliding door. And they came in, and I had to find an assistant to help me. And I got a hold of a student. I think he was in his last year at Chelsea. And I let the blocks stand around in the studio for a couple of weeks before I started. And I knew that we had to cut these two very large blocks up. So this was the saw that I had made. It's a kind of 2 meter, I think it's about 1.5 meters long. It's a tungsten tipped saw that was made for me. These are the handles, which and the whole thing is really rusty now, and it had to be repaired a couple of times. So over 2 years, Adam and I made this piece of work. We built a sort of Egyptian style gantry, because I didn't have a gantry then. With a wooden cradle, we could hoist the blocks of stone up and turn them over, and we cut them all with a saw. That's actually Adam. And with an industrial block of cheese, I cut it. This is a really terrible image, but it's the only one that I have of this. I cut the block of cheese into very small pieces and worked out how we were going to arrange these 8 blocks of stone that we cut up. So this is the work as it was finished in my studio. I didn't want to have any carving in the work at all. So it was all cut by stone, and then the interior of it was, we used a jackhammer and a grinder. And the piece is really all about the interior. It's a kind of place of safety, I think. So there's no polishing on the outside. Everything happens on the interior of the work. I think I always knew that it wasn't going to be enough just to have the alabaster blocks stacked up with this quite precise interior. It needed something else. And what evolved was a sort of wave that was cast in black silicon rubber that fed over the top and sort of flowed down inside. I think this was when it was installed in the Devine Galleries in Tate Britain. I have an interior shot. Oh, but I put this in because this is Jacob Epstein's Jacob and the Angel, which is something, it's a sculpture that I had to go past every morning when we were installing HARBOUR in the Devines. And it's a kind of magnificent sort of horror story, really. It's everything about alabaster that I really hate. It's got a sort of high polish, but that is what it can do, but it isn't really what I wanted it to do. So this is looking down into it, so you can see the interior, which is where all the work is. And that's a detailed shot. It's sort of perverse, really, I think, that you have to really look inside to see the work. And obviously, after 2 3.5 ton blocks, there were lots of bits of alabaster left over. And I've made quite a lot of small works. This is called ANGLEPRESS, and it's 2 pieces of alabaster that are joined together with and there's a piece of papyrus paper which I got in Egypt, which is glued between it. And this is a work that there's a very similar one at Betty Cunning's at the moment, but this is a freestanding one. And the reason I really like this is that it's the end of a block of one of the blocks that we cut up. And the blue which comes through is just so completely wrong. Because it's standing in front of a window, a certain amount of light comes in. And I have to admit that there is something really quite beautiful about the way that it becomes translucent. And the blue is because they touched a lot of blue emulsion paint on the outside of the original block, and that stayed on. And it was just fantastically surprising to see the blue coming through. It's kind of like the sky in a way. And the other part of this that you can't really see in this image is some routed out sort of feathered incisions, like sort of horizontal channels in the stone, and fixed to it is a cast fiberglass plum, which is painted green. The piece is called Drone, and I've made 3 of these, and this is the only freestanding one. The others are fixed onto the wall. And I like the perversity of what the plum is and why it's called Drone. It just felt absolutely right to do that. That's really all I can say about it. And this is a very much smaller piece. And I think there's a piece of white blotting paper that's glued between the very small blocks. It's a very tiny piece. The other thing that I've got in my studio that I've drawn on recently is this cache of brass machine screws, which I've probably had for over 30 years. I imagine they're worth quite a lot of money now. Brass screws there, and they're flat-headed screws, so they're really old school. And quite recently, I made myself make a piece of work because I I've been really stuck in the last year. I freely admit that. It's been really hard to do anything, but I made myself put these cut some brass sheet that I had lying around in a box and screw them together and make this kind of container that could sit on the floor in a very offset sort of way. And jammed inside it is another hexagram, another six-sided sort of star shape made from a very small piece of wood. And then, of course, I realized when I was putting all these images together that I've done this before, probably several times, in fact. This is a work that was made in 1988. It's really, really small. These are the same nuts and bolts, and two pieces of brass trapped together, a very small piece of carved wood that's obviously got lead poured in it at one end. I think an object being trapped in another is a kind of continuing motif in my practice. I've been doing it for years, and it's just a seam of work that I occasionally go back to. The brass nuts and bolts have been in many, many pieces of work, particularly the work that I was making in the late 80s, where I used a lot of sheet leaded steel, which is mild steel that's been sprayed with a sort of lead coating. And normally there were two parts of these works. There would be a very slow carved piece, as you see here, and it would be juxtaposed with a much larger, more quickly made object from sheet steel, put together with nuts and bolts, and all made in the studio, not fabricated outside. So this is a much more successful work, I think, pretty much in the same vein. The piece in the middle that you can't really see is a piece of it's cast bronze. It's a sand cast. It's got a kind of mud sort of texture, very, very kind of liquid. And it separates these two much larger objects made of leaded steel again, that are all bolted together. And I think at the end of the 80s, I was really looking around for a way to change the work from a fabricated object that contained a space that you couldn't really see inside. And I discovered that there was this other material, which is called, which is plastic, obviously. And this is the stuff that ambulance doors are made of, and abattoir walls. It's that very, very cheap plastic. And I began at this point to have work welded up in a plastic factory, fabricated outside, which is a really new thing. This is a really terrible slide, actually, because it makes it look really two-dimensional, but it's a completely sort of nuts piece of work, actually. But the piece that really brought everything to a head, I think, was this Deep Water in 1989, which is an incredibly complicated work. It's about 3 meters from end to end, so very large, and has a lot of fabric in it, a lot of copper tube with copper braid over it that envelops the whole piece. And it was installed in this incredible building in Istanbul. This is Hagia Sophia. It was in the, I think, Istanbul Biennale. And I had a very weird, very narrow space with about 5 doorways in it, and I couldn't even take a photograph of the piece head on, so that was photographed somewhere else. But Hagia Sophia, which is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, I think, while I was there, they were gilding the interior of the dome, and they had built this just incredible scaffolding from pieces of wood, nothing like the scaffolding that we see on buildings today. So there were places for the guys to sleep, to have their lunch, and to climb up. And it was this absolutely wonderful network of pieces of wood. And I think, although this may not be true, but I like to think it is, that this is one of the things that pushed me into really changing the way that I worked. And I started making sculpture using a monocoque form of construction, using sheets of plastic which were cut in a plastic fabrication factory. So monocoque was first used as a way, I think, of building sports cars probably in the 20s. It's got a very, very strong compression strength. You can jump up and down on it. I don't know whether this is a piece of work, but it's the first piece that we made. We started building it up in pieces of cardboard, cutting slots in it, and so it all just completely slots together. There's no other way of construction. And what I really, really like about it, though, and this has become the sort of raison d'etre for all the monocoque pieces, and I think I've probably made about 8 or 9 up to now, is that the interior actually forms the exterior of it. So there is no skin. It's a completely dense sort of mesh, and absolutely what you see is what you get. This is a work called Blue, that's actually in the collection of William Louis Dreyfus in Mount Kisco in upstate New York. So if anyone wants to go there, they can go and see it. And it's strips of blue-grey plastic, and embedded in it is a brass sphere. It was installed at some point in an unfinished building on the 5th floor, which had a zinc. It actually had a zinc floor before they'd put some sort of carpeting or whatever over it. And because there was so much light, it became incredibly elemental, and you could walk around it, and the sphere would, because of refraction and reflection, the sphere would disappear and then appear and then disappear. It was really quite sort of magical, very different from seeing it in artificial light. And I put this slide in because I'm quite interested. I was quite obsessed with the stealth bomber, which obviously I've never seen, but I just found the notion of it as this very beautiful but dangerous flying machine really, really compelling. The fact that it had a sort of cloak of invisibility, and the shape sort of haunted me, and I made my own version of it in a monocoque construction. This is from mild steel, and it's quite a small table piece. It's maybe, I don't know, about 1 meter by 1 meter, and maybe 20 centimeters high. I'm not sure. It's in 3 different layers, which gives it a sort of archaeological site look. And embedded in it is the plastic model of a fighter jet. This is probably the best, I think, the best monocoque piece that we've made, which is made of reclaimed, completely recycled Irico wood. And Adam, probably the best assistant I ever had, who worked on HARBOUR, who now has a really amazing kind of wood construction place. He can make anything in wood, and so we worked on this. And why this was a kind of step forward, I think, from the other monocoque works, is that it has an element of random in it. I didn't want it to be a geometric, really logical kind of object, which some of the others have been, although they've had other complications. But I wanted this to have some clearly random parts to it, both in the colour and the sense in which there are two almost dancing objects that meet together at some point. And embedded in the object, in the sculpture, are about 20 acrylic spheres, all painted in different shades of grey. So spheres are something that have come into lots of different sculptures. This is called Tooth and Claw, and in fact, this is another inverted crown. The part it's a two-part piece of work, and the part on the right, which is a hollowed out piece of oriental plane. They're both bits of oriental plane, which is a really beautiful tree. I rescued a branch of it that was being cut down, kept it in my garden for about 4 years, and then we made this. So the part on the right is hollowed out, and there's a solid acrylic sphere that just sits inside it, just trapped inside it. And the piece on the left is a sort of reversal of it. It's solid, but it has this kind of star shape cut out of it. The sphere in this work, which sits on top of a piece of quite a large, I think it was the largest remaining piece of alabaster from all that alabaster in 1996. So this is 2013. It's a weird shape. I'd call it a solid rhomboid, I think, and it sits on top a cast silicon rubber inner tube. It's the cast of a rubber inner tube, which is, it sounds very kind of paradoxical actually, but I wanted the rubber inner tube, but I knew that a rubber inner tube would sort of deflate and go flat, so I had it cast in silicon rubber. So the alabaster sits on top of it in a very kind of offset, sort of precarious way. And because the sphere, which is an acrylic sphere, is full of sand, and you can just see the hole in the top, I think. And I poured sand in it, so it's quite heavy, and it balances. It looks completely wrong when you see it. It looks as though it should fall over, but it doesn't. I think it's got a really lovely balance. I've always been interested in the equilibrium of objects, how they sit. I used to think that everything had to nestle together like a cup and saucer and to be absolutely straightforward. But now I actually use I would use anything. I'm not such a purist, I think, in the way that things balance. But actually, I think this is a pretty sort of purist way of three things sitting together. And although a balloon isn't really a sphere, there is something spherical about it. And I've made quite a few works where I've had a balloon cast in fiberglass and painted, spray painted, and they're all been spray painted black. There's something about a black balloon, kind of melancholy, and there are a series of these that affix to tablets of cast crystal plaster, which are coloured in wood ash, most of them. So they've got a kind of grey tint. This is a wall piece. And this is another cast balloon, much bigger one, which is kind of purpley, that leans up against a wall of. We cast all this with absolutely no armature. It's in 3 different levels, and they all fit on top of each other. And the balloon has a bronze. I had a wooden sort of twig that I had cast in bronze that leans up against it. And I realize now that all these things, all this cast fiberglass, all these materials, I don't know whether I can use them in the future without, without really thinking it through. Another work with spheres, these are polystyrene, and this is a work called Riptide, which I made to go on top of a modernist building. It's a gallery in on the south coast, a place called Bexhill. It's the Dillawar Pavilion, and they had this fantastic terrace right on the top of the building that just overlooked the sea. And the piece is made of rebar, which is that steel that lines it's the basis, the armature of every single building that's still going up in London. And I wanted to have a kind of quite a sort of poetic line that was interrupted by something else, which is a bit like a riptide, which is a very strong, narrow current that cuts across the way that waves break on the shore. So it's a kind of dangerous current that interrupts it. And I don't often make works outside like this. It was an absolute one-off, but I thought really quite successful. Another outside work, and I'm showing a few works that have been made for outside, was a commission for the Tates and Dives, which opened in 1993. This was in a sort of a kind of hidden space on the top of the building, so you could see it from inside and also from outside. So this red sphere, which is embedded in the perspex truncated cone, you could see it from miles away. Unfortunately, there was a fantastic storm one night, and the whole piece imploded, and the curator phoned me up the next day, told me what had happened, which was really sad because it was before the building had been opened, and actually no one really saw it. Nobody came to see it. And he said, but Alison, as I speak, I see 3 ships going down, so you can tell what the weather's been like here. So the weather is just something that you simply have to deal with. I think this is probably the most successful work that I've made that is installed in the landscape outside. It's in Suffolk at Snape Maltings, and it's made of bronze sheet, and these 2 kind of lozenge shapes, and they're about 2 meters in length, I think, and they sit on keels which go into water. The reeds grow up every year and almost cover them. What you see behind is the sea wall, and because the sea is rising, they're going to have to raise the sea wall. And so at the moment, this sculpture is in storage, and it's going to be reinstalled in what you see on the other side of the sea wall. So actually, I think they're going to be in an even better place. I put this slide in because it's one of the most awesome places that I've ever been to. and I just love the opportunity of showing it. It's called Nakshi Rustem. It's in Iran, and it's the burial place of some kings of many thousands of years ago, Darius, Xerxes, etc. And I recently found an image of the whole site. Obviously, it's very kind of difficult to see this when you're at the base of it, but it's really the most fantastic place. These burial places cut into the cliff. This is Sunderland, which was the centre of shipbuilding up until the 1960s, since when it's become, or it was when in the 1990s, quite a sort of sad place. And I went into a competitive commission to make a piece of work for the River Wear, which it's a really famous river, and there's a famous bridge that goes over it, the Wearmouth Bridge. And this was the piece of work. That's the Wearmouth Bridge, and this is the work that I made. It seemed to take about 5 years to put it all together. It's about 20 meters in length, and what it is, I wanted it to be like the drawing of like a drawing of the outline of a boat, a ship, and it's sections of stainless steel, cylinders of stainless steel that are joined together with links. And so as the river is tidal, it moves and changes shape with the current and the tides in the river. And at night, it was lit by underwater luminaires. And for the first couple of weeks, it was really successful. On the opening night, all the children came down in their pajamas to see it, and it was absolutely amazing. But this is a tidal river, and when there's been a lot of rain in Scotland, everything rushes down, including great logs of wood and everything, and it got completely trashed. And it's actually been a bit of a cause célèbre in Sunderland. I think it's currently, the pieces are all in storage. Occasionally there's a bit of a scandal about it in the papers. It's, waste of money, etc. But, and obviously I think I always knew that it was over-designed. It should have had the brakes put on it much sooner. But everyone who commissioned it was really, really keen to see it on the river. And for a while it was completely magical, but I think we all learned a few lessons from doing that. This is a different outdoor work that's in the garden of a college in Cambridge. And I've got slides of 2 works made when I was a second-year student, I think, at Ravensbourne. So this is 1969, and this is probably, I would say, probably the first piece of sculpture that I made. Our studios were in very temporary wooden huts, and we worked outside all the time. And we were a fantastically competitive bunch, and we worked like dogs, actually. I've never worked as hard as when I was a student here. We would turn up at 7 in the morning and work until we were thrown off the site. Sort of hardcore really wasn't in it. This is I think this is an even earlier work. And in the sort of around November, there was a lot of fog, a lot of mist. And I was really interested in the way that mist defined the edges of pieces. And it would kind of blot something out and you'd see something else. And I think this is something that's sort of remained with my practice. This is a slide of somewhere in Cornwall where there was one morning an amazing quantity of mist. So you see an edge of rock really clearly. And I think the notion of edges, which is what you see when the tide comes in by a river, has always been a really important part of the way that I make work. And in the early 80s, I made a lot of work where the edges were absolutely crucial, and they contained, there would be a flat piece of, in this case, I think it was neoprene or maybe rubber, and there were 3 objects sitting on it. And this is about, I think this is about 2 meters in diameter. So this is made of copper, interlocking copper pieces on which were a piece of slate and a piece of carved stone. And again, the edge was absolutely crucial. A much later work of made from cast silicon rubber, and this is clearly a consequence of the work we were doing on HARBOUR when we cast the top part. So I made about 3 of these, and they're all called carpets. And this one very much had the kind of quality of something melting, something quite watery, where the edges of it were really, really thin and sort of etiolated. And a much earlier work cut from 2 pieces of neoprene. It began with a piece of stone that I did a bit of carving on. I used to carve stone a bit at the beginning of the 80s, and I thought it looked a bit like a horse's head. And so from that, the rest of the work came, which is a bit like I think a bit like an animal skin. I really love small objects, and this is some of the collection I've got of handheld objects. There's a Stone Age axe, some Neolithic arrows, and a shark's tooth, a meteorite, and so on. And I think sometimes when works have been fabricated in a factory outside of the studio, and in a sense, all control over them is lost, which I actually find quite exciting, especially if you don't plan everything through right to the end. I really like making small handheld objects, so I have complete control over them in the way that when something is made outside of the studio, I don't. And I was in a show in, I can't remember when it was, 24, I think, or something, in an antiquarian gallery, and they asked me to choose an object from their collection, and from this object to make a response to it in my own object. And this is the object that I chose, which is a blue marble Egyptian coal pot that contained coal, and it has this really fantastic lid. I think it's maybe 4,000 years old BC. That would be. So the object that I made in response was also a lid made of a circular disc of milled brass, onto which I attached a piece of jasper, which is a stone. It had a wonderful shape, and that turned, and I used that as a lid that fitted over a glass beaker. And the little coal pot is maybe 4.5 centimeters high, and so mine was quite a lot bigger. But I thought they worked really well together as a pair. I tried to buy the coal pot many years later, but didn't have any success. Other very small objects that I've made from wood. This would be probably pear wood, I think. And there's obviously been some lead poured into them. And this is a very early wall piece that's actually in the show at Betty Cunningham's. It's in the collection of William Louis Dreyfus Foundation. And there was a sort of collaboration with work from his foundation. I mean, sadly, he's dead now. Some of the work from his collection is in this show, so it brings together much older work with some much newer works. And I've always liked making works on the wall because they seem to be able to hold an enormous amount of space, as this one does. So it's a carved wooden sort of beaker, I think, that screws into the wall with a piece of shaped brass with a patina that fits over it. I found a desiccated frog in our cellar that probably one of our cats had brought in, absolutely covered in fluff, which I meticulously took off. And I had it fixed onto a piece of brass that was cut into this shape that sits on the wall. And this is a work that I've always been really fond of, and have never been able to remake in any kind of way, because it's just a sort of complete one-off. I made a beaker, a sort of, well, a vessel, a container from copper that went onto the wall, and at the same time I had a bucket of sand which I had pigmented with some blue pigment, and I was very, very frustrated with what I was doing, and I knew there was a connection between the sand and the vessel, but I didn't know how it was going to work and what happened. And in a sort of fit of anger, I think, I threw the bucket of sand into the object on the wall, and most of it fell out, but a lot of it stayed in and just kind of stayed there. So that became the work, complete one-off. It's a much more recent wall piece. And this is a work that's in the show at Betty's. It's another alabaster piece. It's the piece on the card. It's a wall piece, and it has a kind of silver scroll on it, made with silver leaf. And sitting on top is a very rusty coil that I found when I was mudlarking, which is something that I do on the foreshore of the River Thames when the tide is out. It's a really, really magical place, because you're not on the land and you're not in the river, you're on the foreshore, and the tide goes out and then it comes in, and you have to be really careful that you don't get trapped by the tide. And there's all kinds of stuff that can be discovered there. Lots of old pieces of metal, and also brass, sort of Elizabethan brass pins, all kinds of stuff. It's all flotsam and jetsam that's been thrown up by the tides, because obviously people have inhabited the banks of the Thames for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is the last slide, actually, and I've put it in because I think it's the work that, when I made it in 1980, I think I understood what I was trying to do. It began with making these two bags, which are made of very, very thin brass shim, and they're copies of paper bags that, when we were students at the Royal College, we used to go to this hardware shop and buy stuff, and all the bits and pieces, nuts and bolts and so on, would be delivered in these black bags with serrated edges at the top. So I copied these paper bags and in this very thin brass shim, and leaned them up against each other, and they just kind of stood there. And then I drew with a piece of chalk around them the kind of space that I thought they would hold. And then I copied that circular line of chalk in strips with strips of zinc. Just, I think they were, oh no, they were riveted together. That's right. And about 8 years ago, I think, and this work was bought for £350, which is just a bit more than what I'm being paid for doing this lecture, I think. And I needed to have it remade because I think it had got badly sort of crushed. So I asked a friend of mine, because when I originally made this, and this is the last slide, this is the original image. When I made this, I was really, really bad at making things. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm brilliant now. And I knew that I had to remake it in the same, it had to be remade in the same spirit as that which I made the original. And so I asked a friend of mine, who's also a really good artist, to make it for me, because I knew that she was probably about as, not exactly cat-handed, but had the same kind of level of expertise as I did. So she remade it in the same spirit, and I think she did a really good job. But this is the original as it was photographed in 1980, and that's the last slide. So I think we're open for any questions. Sorry, I've run over time.
Thank you, Alison. That was really fascinating, and really generous. It's amazing to see your connection to these very alive materials, like just pulling them out of the Thames. For me, so yeah, please do put some questions in at the bottom of the screen. I know it's late for Alison, but we do have some time. And I've got a question from Carolina. She's asking if you could tell us or give advice based on your experience, what to do when you are stuck or struggling with the work.
When you're stuck, okay, sweep the studio, give it a really good tidy, so you've got some space, so you can see what. So there's a kind of space to put something in. I always find it helps to put all my tools away. But when you're stuck, probably the best thing to do is to leave the studio, to go and look at something else, to go out there. That isn't what I do. I probably always would go to the studio, be very, very kind of depressed, play lots of music, but eventually something will kick in. I think the thing is not to give up. Everyone gets stuck at some time, and I think people are really reluctant to admit that there are times when absolutely nothing works. But it happens to everyone. It's not the end of the world, although it seems like it. And mine's been going on for a while, actually, but I may be getting out of it. I don't know. I hope so.
I hope so. I'm just curious, because you showed the images from Iran and Turkey. Do you travel a lot, like as your own source, or is it like something like installing work bringing you to these places? Just
well,
how does?
I haven't traveled anywhere for ages. We went to
in normal times.
Well, when my husband was alive, he really loved going to the Middle East, and we went to Syria and Iran and Lebanon and Egypt a few times. But going to Istanbul was really special, because I've been there quite a lot, and installing work in a city that is so sort of strange and different from from London was really fantastic, actually.
Alice, Alice says, thanks for the great talk. Can you speak more about the reckoning with materials you have used in the past? For example, plastics or steel that you mentioned at the beginning?
It's all bad, isn't it? It's all bad stuff. I don't really know what the solution is. Because the stuff I've got in the studio, you know, the backlog of leftovers and material, it's finite, and at some point I'm going to have to bite the bullet and find, well, either find a material that I don't know about, or I think maybe recycled and reclaimed stuff is probably the answer. So scrapyards, that kind of thing, because it's lying around. I mean, if this is the Alice that I think it is, she knows exactly what I'm talking about, and I know what she means too.
There's a comment here about just how amazing the talk has been, and just but unless anyone else has questions, this might be the end of the conversation. Thank you, Alison. It's been really interesting to learn about your work, and I just want to encourage everyone to go see the show at Betty Cunningham's on the Lower East Side. It's up until November 6th, and Alison, I hope you're able to travel to New York safely.
Well, at some point, I hope so too. And thank you very much for asking me, because although I don't enjoy doing talks like this, it's always really, really good to put images together and to find connections between pieces of work and see things that you hadn't noticed before. So it's all good anyway. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, get home safe, and hopefully the next time we see each other, we'll have a drink to cap it off.
Definitely. That's what's missing at the end of this anyway. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
And
Bravo.
goodbye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.